Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Just before we get into today's interview, I'd like to speak to you, our audience, about who we are seeking to reach and how we would like to do that. One of the groups we would like to respectfully serve through these podcasts is our pastors. And we want to acknowledge that these leaders have been appointed by God. We understand that they are often very busy with life and ministry before we even mention global ministry. And so we want to first stop and say, thank you. We are so grateful for your ministries and for your work on behalf of the body. We know that you have many, many things to balance as you serve the Lord, His people, and your communities. Our goal then is to serve you with encouragement and with ideas and resources, as well as to equip others in the church, primarily missions committees or missions teams, to be helpfully alongside it and to be coordinated, to be aligned. And so we want to thoughtfully and respectfully submit these ideas, hoping sometimes they will be of encouragement, sometimes they will challenge you, but that they would always be of benefit to you. Now, if you're not a pastor, please don't tune out. The ideas in this episode will also be helpful to people serving in the church, whether it's on a missions committee or not. We hope that it will help you understand and support your pastor. So, with all this being said, let's get started. Our guest today is David Meade, who, together with his wife Kathy, has been serving in missions ministry for several decades. He served in the Philippines, where he was involved with church planting as well as serving mission workers. And in the U.S., he has helped lead a mission agency and worked in local church missions mobilization. In 2003, David helped found Propempo International, an organization that we will talk about today and that helps church leaders mobilize their people for world evangelization. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Max. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Just as we get going, please take a minute and just introduce yourself a little bit. Give us an idea of your experience in helping churches with missions.
Well, I think the thing I'd like to lead off with is, although I am a missionary and a little bit of a missiologist, I bleed local church. Local church to me is the central agent of God's work in the world. It's the end goal of missions. I was involved with local church planting before I went to the mission field, when I went to the mission field, and since I've been off the mission field helping church pastors. So local church is so important to me. And it continues to be in my personal life and ministry, as well as working with Propempo to help churches.
Well, that's going to resonate. It certainly resonates with us at the podcast and a lot of our audience. We sometimes use Steve Moore's quote. He said, "The church is the primary stakeholder in the Great Commission. Not the only stakeholder, but the primary stakeholder." And that sounds like that's just lined exactly up with what you just said.
Exactly. I agree.
Please just take a minute here and let's talk about Propempo just for a moment. What is this organization that you've helped birth along the way?
Well, prior to Propempo, I was a part of ACMC, which stands for Advancing Churches and Missions Commitment. I was a leader there, but ACMC dissolved and went off the scene. As it did, I had permission from ACMC leadership and encouragement from my own church elders to start Propempo. Propempo is the New Testament Greek word which means to send forward. It implies to send forward fully equipped, and it's used in the context of sending out missionaries for gospel work. So that's what we help churches do. We help them identify, train, send, shepherd, guide, and help missionaries get to the field, particularly hard places, strategic, unreached people groups. And we've been doing this now for 16 years.
Well, as you can hear, our audience can hear, David brings a lot of experience to today's conversation about some keys for helping pastors in leading their churches in missions. Not long ago, he had a blog post that we learned of. It's entitled 10 Easy Keys to Pastoral Leadership in Missions. We're going to include a link to that blog post in the show notes, so you can check that out. And we are going to dive into these 10 keys. David, let's jump in. Would you share the first key of helping pastors lead missions in their churches?
Yeah. Pastors need to walk the talk. And what I mean by that is pastors all agree that missions is an important aspect of churches, but they don't often really get involved with it, especially in terms of leadership and modeling the priority of missions in their personal and family life. So we like pastors to do that, to enhance their relationships with missionaries and get more involved in leading the church in missions.
Where have you seen a pastor that has done this well? Maybe not a specific one, but for example, what does that look like when a pastor does this well, when he walks the talk?
When he walks the talk, he's very familiar with the missionaries that the church supports or sends. I would say on a first name basis. Maybe he does Skype calls from time to time, certainly valuing visiting them on the field as the occasion allows, but also familiar with the mechanics of operation of missions in the church, knowing how funds are used, approved, knowing how the missions team or mission committee operates, perhaps even being a part of it. In his personal and family life, making sure that his family is aware of missions and not just his niche in the church ministries, but the missions ministry of the church at whole.
Oh, very good. It sounds like you're speaking to a familiarity, really, that is evidenced, as the church moves along then. Number one is walk the talk. And that leads to the next, number two, the second key is?
Learn the lingo. Missions has its own vocabulary. Just as the pastor has probably studied in Bible school or seminary, there's a vocabulary for hermeneutics. There's a vocabulary for theology. There's a little bit of a technical vocabulary for missions. And it's really good for the pastor to understand what the 1040 window is. It's not the US IRS form you submit on April 15. It's a section of geography around the world. And things like that, to know what the lingo is and what the current dialect of mission is for your church.
I wonder here if, many of our listeners are serving on missions committees or go teams. They're called different things, of course. I wonder whether you have suggestions for that group and how they could help their pastor learn the lingo.
It's almost necessary to appoint a friend or a colleague, somebody who can come alongside the pastor to give him just the cream of the latest good mission articles or biographies or information about what's going on in missions, so the pastor doesn't get overwhelmed. When they have a trusted friend that may be assigned by the missions team, they can figure that they're going to get the right kind of information and learn the right kind of lingo.
Well, what I hear you saying is the committee really can serve, or the team can really serve the pastor, who often these people are very, very busy already, and there is a sense of overwhelm, and it's like, oh my goodness, this is another thing I need to learn and get my head around.
Absolutely. The pastor can easily feel overwhelmed in an area that he has not received much training in through his schooling.
Okay, the first is walk the talk. The second is learn the lingo, some of the language. What do you have as the third key?
Third is pray like you mean it. However fervently you think you want your people to pray for you and your ministry and your preaching and teaching and your leadership, you should pray that way for your missionaries. There's lots of good biblical examples for praying for missionaries to have opportunity and for protection and for their life and their family and their team. Pray like you mean it. Pray with understanding and pray with a regularity. So I just encourage pastors to add it in their prayer life. It makes a difference then to their receptivity and sensitivity to the topic of missions and missionaries in their regular ministry.
Now, you're mentioning, it sounds like a kind of a personal prayer life, the personal prayer. How does that fit with corporate prayer? Do you have ideas about that?
Personally, I think that every corporate prayer in a worship service should include something of the greatness of God in the world, which is an aspect of missions. If the pastor himself is praying a pastoral prayer in a public service, it's always good to include what is the latest, hottest, most important or strategic prayer for missionaries that you have on the table. Doesn't mean you have to pray for all of them all the time. It's not like reading a long list, but being very specific and bringing it into the church's attention as you pray together before the Lord.
Well, here I'd like to mention just a couple of resources on the side here. We'll include them in the show notes. There's another episode of the podcast this year in the 5th season here entitled How to Pray for Your Missionary. And that will be posted there. We'll include a link there. And I'll also just mention a printed resource that we can offer by PDF. It actually comes from Send, the organization I serve with. It's a bookmark on how to pray for your missionaries. On one side, it has a list of prayer requests for each day of the week for missionaries. And on the reverse side, it's how you can pray each day of the week for MKs or missionary kids. So if you're looking for resources to step into praying for missions, there are a couple that you can consider there. So walk the talk, learn the lingo. I won't repeat these every time. Pray like you mean it. What's the next key for pastoral leadership of missions?
The next key is to become a stakeholder. And by that, I mean the pastor should regularly make it a part of his life to spend some personal time, his treasure, his talent for world missions. In what ways can he assist the missionary? In what ways does he give? Sometimes pastors make an excuse that because they're in ministry, they don't have to give sacrificially toward missions. Other people give to make the ministry happen. But if you own it and you're a stakeholder yourself, other people will see that. It will come out in your relationship and even in questions from your parishioners in how you personally are involved in world missions.
I wonder if you could give us a practical example that you've seen, David, of a pastor who really has stepped into this and evidenced this key of becoming a stakeholder.
I know of one pastor very well who found this to be a new and novel idea. And as he began to consider what to do and how to do it, it has had a fairly deep impact on his life in public ministry by taking concern and beginning to actually exercise this stakeholder idea. So he does Skype the missionaries that the church supports on a rotation basis in a way that fits into a schedule. Doesn't have to take a lot of time. He actually does give more and very intentionally to missions and to missionaries that he knows, not just those in the church, and gets into their life as well. He spends personal time kind of training his kids about missions and asking for time for the church to go visit missionaries on an occasional basis.
Excellent. I wonder if some pastors hear this and they are just so aware of their busy schedules. If you could speak to someone who's, really wants to participate more adequately. A pastor says, boy, I would like to get into this. I know I should. Do you have suggestions for a first step or first couple of steps that they might take to become a stakeholder?
Just send an email around letting the missionaries know that you are personally concerned as pastor with their ministry and ask them how you can pray. I think that little bit takes very little time. It can be virtually the identical email sent to several missionaries. It doesn't all have to be CC'd, but personalized. And as you get replies back, I guarantee you the pastor is going to become more of a stakeholder.
Well, it sounds like a good suggestion, easy place to start. I also just encourage those of you serving on missions committees or missions teams to think how you can facilitate some of this and help your pastor if we can keep the barriers low so that they can become stakeholders without feeling overwhelmed. Watch for those opportunities. David, the next principle or the next key that you would share with us, number 5.
I say hold values over sentiment. And what I mean by that is pastors and churches kind of get sideswiped over time with supporting just those who are friends of the pastor. Somebody has a relationship, the pastor happens to be a gatekeeper of sorts for missions, and without really asking too many questions about does it fit our church or what is our strategy involved, they end up with a world map that looks like a shotgun blast instead of values-driven rifle shot. So the pastor needs to learn how to embrace the core values of missions for the church and not let sentiment guide their decisions and influence.
Well, this is a challenge to make sure that the ministry efforts that are far away remain aligned with the local church. I wonder whether you have suggestions on how to make sure that those stay aligned. How can we make sure that the church's key values are reflected in the missions efforts?
One of the key things we do in Propempo is meet with the pastor and elders, or the top leadership group of the church that is the decision makers for the church, and have them come to unity on what are their primary values for missions. For example, what comes out of that is we want our missionaries to be in doctrinal alignment with our church and tradition. Another one would be we want to emphasize church planting in pioneering type of areas. Well, those two by themselves, along with others that they might consider, really help shape the direction of what ministries they support and how well they support them.
Well, that'll be helpful. And early in the process, I would expect too, right? I suppose in some churches, there's already a missions program and it could be aligned or not. But especially as development takes place, early to have that unifying conversation between church leadership and any missions committee or missions initiative.
Absolutely. And it takes wisdom and grace to navigate between what is the ideal, which you set out on paper, not driven by emotions, and what is present. So the key is, as we say in Propempo, how to get from here to there.
Very good. Well, in a moment, we'll discuss some more of the keys to pastoral leadership of missions. Just before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share this missions resource with you. We hope it will be helpful to you and your church.
Would you like to expand and improve your church's missions efforts? Catalyst Services is ready to help you. Visit catalystservices.org to find excellent resources and training opportunities, and to sign up for Postings, a monthly e-newsletter with advice and tools for churches. You can also listen to conversations with Ellen Livinggood, the founder of Catalyst Services, right here on the podcast. Check out episode 106, called Engaging Your Church's Untapped Missions Potential. And now, back to today's conversation.
We are back with David Meade of Propempo International, and we're talking about 10 keys to pastoral leadership of missions in a local church. Just before we continue on, David, I'd like to ask you, these principles, do they apply to a church of a particular size? Do you have to have a particular size church for this to work?
No, the principles are valid for any church size. There is a distinction, though, with a small church versus a large church. A small church, the pastor has more call on his time. He's expected to be sort of jack of all trades. He has less, perhaps, flexibility in his schedule to be able to apply it. But in a larger church, the negative side is that there's more bureaucracy to work through to make changes and influence decisions. The good side in a larger church is often there's more staff and administrative support. And so the pastor can choose to have more influence in missions and make it work.
Simply more bandwidth that way. And here I would want to speak encouragement toward the missions team again, or missions committee, that you can help provide some of that bandwidth as well in serving the pastor. Well, I'm going to resist listing the previous 5 keys. Let's go right on to number 6. David, what is key number 6 to helping with the pastoral leadership of missions?
The next one is see, teach, and preach missions in the Word. Often pastors get on a roll on their expositional book they're teaching, or a series of topics or theme that they're teaching for the season, and they fail to even see missions in the Word. Missions permeates the Word. Anytime you think of God's glory and his passion for his glory to all nations, it's all over the place. But sometimes pastors need some instruction in doing that. The key illustration is John Piper, actually. He used to take vacation during missions conference. One missions conference, he had to fill in for a speaker that had to bail at the last minute. Those 8 messages from that missions conference completely opened his eyes to missions in the Word like he'd never seen it before, and it became the book we know as Let the Nations Be Glad.
Well, remarkable. Now, some pastors will feel they did get some exposure to this in seminary and they should include it. I wonder whether you have any ideas just to offer a pastor how often might there be a focus on missions? You've said missions comes out of the scriptures all over the place, but should there be a focus on preaching specifically about missions? And if so, for instance, how often might that take place?
That's a great question. Because of the importance of missions and its priority through the scriptures and its priority in the ministry of the church, I strongly feel that the church ought to have at least an annual emphasis on missions, where missions messages are given through a long weekend event, or perhaps, as many churches do, a special missions Sunday every quarter, in which messages about missions are drawn from the scripture, illustrations, and missions information is given during those times.
Okay, well, there's some ideas to consider. See, teach, and preach missions in the Word. What is the next key you have for us?
The next one is it's not a competition. You can easily mistake that for meaning that we do this in partnership with mission agencies and other like minded people on fields of ministry, and that's true. But what I mean by this is within the local church, there's a natural fear for the pastor to think if I emphasize missions, if I get involved in leading missions in a bigger way, somehow that's going to cut into the volunteers and the finances of other ministries of our church. And I want to tell you that dynamically, it doesn't work that way. It's not a zero sum game. If missions gets a bigger slice of the pie, doesn't mean that everybody else gets a smaller slice of the pie. In God's providence and in his work, the resources flow to those things that have the priority and value that God puts on it. So when you're putting priority on missions, you're not cutting something else out. In fact, missions becomes a focal point for the end results of the Sunday school teaching and the local outreach and the men's ministry and the women's ministry and all of the ministries of the church.
Well, I can understand that being a concern for a pastor, that there are only so many resources to go around. But what I hear you saying is that it tends not to draw away, but rather leads to a growing of resources that reflects God's heart for the nations.
That's right. I've had pastors tell me that once they had a proper sort of priority on missions in their church, then is when the floodgates of resources tended to open up.
Well, here I'm going to mention another episode of the Global Missions Podcast. It's number 91, and it was entitled Balancing Local and Global Mission Priorities. That was with Doug Christgau, and I would encourage you to check out that episode if you're working on this balance. Well, should we do missions locally or globally? Hear what Pastor Doug has to say in that episode. David, we are through 6 and 7. Number 7, understand it's not a competition. What is the 8th key to pastoral leadership of missions?
The next key is engage the whole church. We really teach and preach through Propempo the whole church mobilization. Often we tend to think of missions as sort of a side issue for specialized people, and the missions team or committee sort of works over in the corner, and they do missions on behalf of the church. We strongly encourage people to think differently about that. The role of the missions team and committee, including the pastor's influence, is to see everyone in the church be a world Christian, everyone participating in the Great Commission in whatever way they may.
Well, that sounds very healthy too, that it's not set aside for an elite few or even just a section of the church, but rather it's embraced by everyone. Our audience is familiar with the concepts also of goers and senders, that there's a role for everyone in global missions. Yeah, engage the whole church. It makes good sense. Now, key number 9 is about sharing the load. What is the 9th key you suggest for pastoral leadership of missions?
Delegation. Trust but verify. The pastor needs to learn how to delegate. Obviously, it's a big task. It does require specialized people doing it. The pastor's role in influencing and leading doesn't mean that the pastor has to do it. So find trustworthy people, find people that you can communicate well with and they communicate with you, people who are going to accept the role of helping the church become mobilized in missions, as well as the administrative aspects of managing whatever funds and communication and events and all of that that comes out of missions in the church.
Well, here again, we hear a role of trust in a missions committee or missions team in a church. And I know in a moment we're going to talk about Propempo and some of the resources they have to build this relationship between the pastoral leadership of a church and the missions committee so everybody's on the same page. That was alignment, that was earlier on. But that really enables a pastor to delegate with trust to a group of people that he knows will move in alignment with the church. We'll get to that in just a minute. That was number 9. David, what is the 10th and final principle you'll share with us for pastoral leadership of missions?
The last one is go touch, see, feel, taste, and smell it for yourself. There is nothing like putting your feet on the ground to catch the vision of missions.
Well, what a great suggestion this is. And just from a quick personal story here, our senior pastor is just returning from the mission field where he went with a dear brother who's familiar with that part of the world, and they went to see our mission workers there, to see the ministry on site themselves. We haven't even heard his report yet. It'll be this Sunday. And we've heard good things already, but we know that this will inspire our pastor. He will see the world in a different way. What have you seen? How have you seen pastors' ministries be adjusted after they have experienced it themselves?
It is nothing less than amazing. I remember our first pastoral visit when we were on the field. It was an afterthought for this dear brother who was attending our country for a conference and thought maybe he should visit us. We went to a village church. He met some of the local believers. He saw where we lived. His report afterward that it was life-changing. It totally changed the way he thought about missions, the way he taught about missions, because he was able to touch, see, feel, taste, and smell it. He knew what the stress was. He shadowed us. He listened. He asked questions. He was not in the limelight. He was a visitor shepherd, and that is perfect for the pastor to do it that way.
Well, as helpful as it is for the pastor, I wonder, this is a bit of a sidelight, but just speak a little bit. How did you feel as mission workers when your pastor came to see you? What does it do for the missionary?
It's wonderful. We felt honored because we know that the pastor doesn't have a lot of time and sometimes doesn't have a lot of resources to do that. We felt loved and shepherded. We really felt like this was a fantastic priority for the church to enable and allow the pastor to do it. We also felt like we were going to be well represented back at the church that sent us.
Well, here I'd just like to plant this idea in the missions committees. If you have any influence over the budget of the work that's going on from your church, would you consider including resources to send your pastor or someone from the pastoral team or church leadership to the mission field? And could that be done every couple of years even to see one of the leaders from the church visit one of your mission workers? It is a great blessing both ways, as we've heard David say. Well, I'll just review these last 5 that we've talked about since the break. Number 6 was see, teach, and preach missions in the Word. Number 7, understand missions is not a competition with other ministries. Number 8, engage the whole church. Number 9, delegate where possible to trusted partners. And number 10, go experience it for yourself. David, just as we wind down, we've just touched on these things so quickly. What resources do you have to recommend to our audience where they could dive a little deeper into these things?
The first thing I would mention is a book that we authored called Here to There. It's Getting to Your Mission Field. It was initially written for the participants in the cross missions conferences that are held about every other year, but it includes a lot of ecclesiology in it. Pastors, I encourage to read it because it demonstrates the role of the local church in the whole process, and pastors can easily see how they might function in their role in the process of developing candidates and shepherding them on the field. Another one is on our website, we have a a diagnostic tool called Church Missions Profile, and it enables a church pastor or missions team leader to walk through 12 different categories and rank themselves based on benchmarks of the top effective churches in North America. And it allows them to see then, sort of by learning in the diagnostic, where they're short and where they're good, and what steps they can take to move up the steps in rank.
Well, here are some excellent suggestions of resources. We will include those in the show notes. Also in the show notes, we're going to include another couple of episodes that along the way have related to this topic. Pastor Randy Smart out from Central Canada, out on the prairies, was a pastor who went on short-term missions, met the missionaries on the field, and his ministry was changed. We did a whole episode with him back in number 96. I won't mention all of these, but encourage you to check out the show notes with other relevant episodes. David, if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you, they'd like to dive a little deeper, how could they reach out to you?
They can email me. It's very simple. It's david@propempo.com. And I will do my best to answer personally.
Super. Thank you for being accessible that way. And thank you for taking this time with us and just helping us to very quickly scan across these 10 ideas for pastoral leadership and missions. Very glad you've been with us. May the Lord bless you as you go forward.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I trust and pray that your audience will continue to grow in missions for the sake of God's glory around the world.
Well, we moved very quickly through that material, and there were lots of ideas, I know. We hope that it stirred your hearts and minds with some practical things to consider. Remember, you can check the show notes, and if you're a pastor and you visit globalmissionspodcast.com, you can filter by the word pastor and find those episodes and resources that are designed especially to serve you. This episode of the Global Missions Podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.